It's an exciting Sunday. I love this Sunday when it rolls around. The first Sunday in, October, we celebrate and remember the heritage of St. Francis of Assisi. But we're also continuing to talk about the Ten Commandments. Rather than switching or taking a Sunday off, we're continuing through this conversation about the Ten Commandments in Exodus, right? And so, pop quiz, let's see what we remember. Commandment 1 is? No other gods. Okay, not a rhetorical question, all right? Commandment 2 is? Not graven images. You're Baptists. Not anymore. Right? So commandment 2 is you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Commandment 3, Sabbath. Commandment 4, parents, honor your parents. Commandment 5, do not murder. Commandment 6, do not commit adultery. So sure, St. Francis, pets, and adultery. And as we read the Sermon on the Mount, you also get divorce. So your divorced pastor is up here to share with you a little bit about what Jesus also says about divorce. Because it all ties together. I know you don't think it will, but hang in here with me, all right? First, the elephant in the room, that bit about divorce that so often gets used to condemn people who have experienced the heartbreak of a failed marriage. So, in the context of where Jesus was talking, first of all, you should know that a man was able to divorce his wife for any reason. I'm bored. You burnt my toast. You forgot to make me coffee. You haven't borne me a son. For any reason whatsoever, a man was able to say, I'm tired of this marriage. Now, not the other way around, to be clear, right? A husband was able to divorce his wife for any reason whatsoever. All he had to do was write out a certificate of divorce, have it attested by one of the rabbis, and it was done. Which then meant that woman was ruined. No one wanted to remarry her. She had already been married. She could not inherit her family's land. She was a woman. She likely had no children that were in charge of taking care of her. She was reduced at that point to a beggar on the whim of her husband for any reason. So when Jesus says the only reason that you can get a divorce is unfaithfulness, and that if you divorce for other reasons, it's not good, it's actually a word of grace for the vulnerable women in that community. It's actually a word of defense of women who were otherwise abandoned. Now, what I find interesting is often the preachers who say you're going to hell if you divorce and remarry because of what Jesus says in Matthew 5, ignore the bit right before it that say if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It's literally the verse before. That part is figurative, but the divorce part, oh, that's very literal, right? People who are literalists always choose what they're literalists about. Now, my own experience has been even when it's the right decision, divorce is heartbreaking and tragic. Even when it's the right decision. It's just hard. And I think Jesus acknowledges that. It's heartbreaking, even when it's the right decision. And as a point, because I know that people wrestle with this, I know in my own experience, when we got a divorce, we hadn't been married for years by that point, right? If the point of marriage is, as we say in the marriage service, the love and comfort given to one another, the help and mutual support given to one another, we hadn't done that for a long time. And so when we got a divorce, that piece of paper only said what was already true. As people of faith, as Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, we let our yes be yes and our no be no. We call a thing what it is. And because we divorced, my daughter's mother and I were both able to remarry and have joyful marriages in which our child could grow up. And that's a gift and a grace. I just like to address that because that's one of those bombs that people like to drop sometimes, one of that bit of church trauma that sometimes we carry with us. And it's all connected to how we think about our loves and our relationships and our marriages and our partnerships with one another. So adultery, fun topic, right? Adultery. Again, as we come to the Sermon on the Mount and Exodus 20, where we have the 10 Commandments, Jesus gives us a new way of understanding this. At its heart, if you just read Exodus 20, what's adultery about? What is adultery? Sin. Sin of sex. Sex with somebody you're not married to, right? Jesus says, no, that ain't it. Right? We tend to go, just like murder, we tend to say, I haven't murdered anybody, I'm okay. Oh, but Jesus says, not so much. You got hate in your heart. Adultery, too. He asks us to look beyond the external act and look into our hearts. Now, to be clear, I am not old enough to remember this myself, but I read about it. There once was a president named Jimmy Carter. And when he was running for president, he was asked about adultery with his wife Rosalind. And he said, I have committed adultery in my heart. And he kind of got laughed at, because what a silly idea. But that's exactly what Jesus says. Adultery starts long before that external act. Long before we get caught sleeping with somebody who's not our partner, we had committed adultery already. Jesus says, whenever you look at someone with lust in your heart, you are guilty of adultery. Y'all, we're in trouble. Adultery ultimately is not about sex. It's about how we look at others. In fact, the connection between our hearts and our eyes comes to the center of these commandments again and again and again. You see, we're in the business sometimes, and there's big money to be made in turning people into objects. There is boodles of cash, hand over fist, to be made in turning God's children into sexual objects for our pleasure. From TV shows to advertisements, it infects our heart. And going from these objectifying media images, we then begin to objectify the people that we meet in the world, don't we? We look at somebody and we say, oh, that's a nice rear end. Maybe we don't say it that way, but I'm in church. Right? We think in our mind, you know what I'd like to do? And we look at that stranger that we've encountered, and we see them not as God's beloved child, but as a piece of meat for our gratification, even if it's just in our imagination, for our own personal pleasure in our mind. And that's the first step toward beginning to imagine doing other things with other people who are not our partners. And that imagining of doing other things with other people who are not our partners is the next step. You see, long before we ever step out on somebody, we've already run the thought through in our mind hundreds, thousands of times. And at its heart, it's a failure to see each other as God's beloved children. Now, I'm a city boy. I couldn't live in a rural environment again. I did it for a long time, about a decade. But the thing about living in a rural environment is everybody knows everybody. And so you see a stranger in the grocery store that looks cute. You might begin to think something, but then you remember that that's Mr. Smith's granddaughter. And you used to see her when she sat in church picking her nose. And it's a lot harder to follow that train of thought, right? Because she's not an object. She's not a piece of meat. She's not just there for my gratification and enjoyment. She is a person, a beloved child of God with a family and a history. When we live in large environments like we do, 120,000, 125,000 people in the Woodlands, there's a whole lot more people I don't know who are genuine strangers. And it's a lot easier to objectify a stranger. Y'all, this is the first step, whether we're talking about adultery or back to Commandment 5, murder. This is the first step along the road, is seeing the other person as an object. If we're mad at them, it's easy to see them as an object, as a fool, as Jesus says. If we find them attractive, it's easy to see them as an object of sexual desire and my imagination. But again and again, Jesus calls us to the hard work of seeing every person we encounter as a beloved child of God. Now, this is the leap. It's hard to see our neighbor as a beloved child of God. But I also think, as we think about St. Francis, it's also about all of creation. That's also how we're able to rip the top off of a mountain so that we can get the resources out of it. Pollute a river because it's the easiest way for us to produce power or aluminum or whatever we need. But all of creation, God looked at it and said, what? It is what? God said it with more authority, though. It is what? Good. And so we gather and we celebrate our pets, but our pets remind us about something that's true about all of creation. The trees that surround us, the water that runs through these creeks, the air above us, it is all created by God and it is good. It is not an object for us to use and abuse. It's been entrusted to us. All of the 10 Commandments in the Sermon on the Mount come back to again and again. How do you see the world? Do you see the world, the people in it? The nature that surrounds us, the people on the other side of the globe, as objects, news headlines, things to lust for and lust after? Or do you see them as God sees them? Do you see them with God's eyes? Eyes that see belovedness and beauty and goodness and joy. As a pastor, one of the joys of my job is I get to sit down and to talk with people. Y'all, I get paid to go sit and have coffee and chat with people and learn about their lives. It's wonderful. Here's a thing that I have learned in 18 years of ministry. Every person that walks by you in the mall, every person that you read a news story about, Every person that you look at the beach down in Galveston, they've got a story of joys and sorrows, a story of ups and downs, a story that is as important as yours. Because just as you are God's beloved child, they also are God's beloved child. Amen.